Hi, AP World students. Mrs. Longnecker here again. And today I want to do a vocab lesson. Specifically, the vocabulary we're looking at today is economic in nature, because in really the second half of AP World History, so the 19th and 20th centuries, so that's units 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all of these units aren't primarily economic, right? They are social and political and cultural and technological and environmental. But there are some economic ideas and trends during these time periods, right? Two big centuries, that if we understand them, can help us to break through some of the stereotypes about particularly non-European, non-Western countries that have developed over time and that contribute to really racist attitudes toward people of color as we study and think about world history. So we're going to talk about these economic terms and try to give you just a little bit of context in this video, primarily relating to how these ideas fit in with the 19th century. Remembering, though, that all of these terms are going to remain significant and important as you learn about the 20th century as well. So grab a pen, grab some paper, get ready to jot down some vocab, because hopefully this will be really helpful, and it is for sure really important. The first economic vocab term I want to present to you today is the term commodity. Now, a commodity, basic definition, is a good that can be bought and sold equally, regardless of where it was produced or who produced it. So often a commodity refers to an industrial crop, which I'll define in just a minute, minerals or cash crops. And the idea here is that for some products, it matters who produced a particular good. An iPhone, for example, is different than an Android phone, and a Nokia phone is different from a Samsung phone. The brand and the production of those items matter. But for some trade goods, it doesn't really matter who produced it. A pineapple is a pineapple. And so a pineapple is a really good example of a commodity good that can be produced in a number of different places in the world and can be traded, bought, and sold fairly equally, regardless of who produced it. Now, in the 19th century, as the economy grows increasingly globalized, control of commodity trade became increasingly important. Empires that could control commodity production directly did so. But sometimes when an empire couldn't control all the production of an entire commodity, which they might attempt to do, there were other mechanisms for economic pressure or economic control in these commodity markets. So as you're thinking about the history of the 19th century, as you're thinking about the shift in power, economically speaking, especially toward industrialized nations, these industrialized nations were seeking to control commodity trade, both in goods that they produced directly and in goods that they could produce throughout their colonies. One of the key examples that I gave of commodities were industrial crops. So I want to give you a definition for that term next. An industrial crop is a crop that is grown to produce goods for manufacturing rather than as food for consumption. So industrial crops, right, we would think about things like cotton, right? Today, we might think of soy as an industrial crop, because while soybeans are still sometimes eaten, and soy is in a lot of food that people eat today, soy is also used for biodiesel and for other industrial processes. So industrial crops, right, we're still rooted in agriculture, but we're sometimes producing crops not necessarily for the survival of a community, but to support this big manufacturing process. Cash crops kind of go along with industrial crops, and cash crops can include industrial crops. as well as food crops. And the difference here is that an industrial crop is specifically for manufacturing purposes, whereas a cash crop is anything that's being grown primarily for sale rather than to feed the local community that's growing it. Sugar is almost always considered a cash crop, that its primary value is in the price you can get for selling it rather than the good that it does the particular community growing it. And again, in the 19th century, industrial crops and cash crops were a source of wealth and power for the industrialized imperialist nations, primarily of the West. And it goes along with another key vocab idea that we need, which is an export economy. An export economy is a system or a nation that relies on international trade or export to support its economy. Usually, an export economy is just maybe a single product or a limited number of products or goods being produced in that country for export. Many of the non-industrialized nations in the 19th century became export economies as a result of this increasing globalization. So if they were colonies of an empire, colonies sometimes would become specialized for a particular raw material, whether it was cotton or iron or rubber or valuable minerals, right? The whole colony would become focused around the production or extraction of this particular good that was seen as a benefit to the empire. One of the important implications of this for these non-industrialized nations is that they became dependent on their empires to sell other goods. So, right, you would be producing, if you're a cotton producing region, you're producing cotton and you're selling it to the homeland, essentially, of your empire. So if you're in India, perhaps all of your cotton is going to Britain into the textile mills. But your community needs more than cotton to survive, so you become dependent on the sale of that cotton to bring in funds to purchase the other food and goods that your community is now not producing, but that you still need for survival. And the limited diversity of these export economies make them much more fragile within the broader global system. It also means that non-industrialized countries had less opportunities to industrialize. The empires didn't see a need to invest in industrial infrastructure in most of these export economy regions, right? If the economy is built around bringing something into your empire, that's good for the empire. It's not necessarily good for that colony and for its later independence. The one exception to this lack of infrastructure does seem to be transportation. Railroads and other transportation infrastructure was built into many of these colonies because it made sense to get the goods out of the colonies and into the market as quickly and efficiently and cheaply as possible. But in terms of, say, moving factories closer to where cotton was being grown, that didn't happen. And so we see an increased dependency for these export economies on the larger and industrialized states. We see a fragility in their economies, and we see that the pathway to economic independence, which might also be a pathway to political independence, is really shortchanged by that lack of infrastructure investment in those regions. So you can kind of see how, right, industrialized states are demanding or desiring commodities to either please their customers or as raw materials for their industrial production. And so for the industrialized states, going out and claiming empires is to their benefit. But we should also see in just this vocab here a little bit of the story of why colonized states struggled to achieve their independence. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that in places where commodities were being grown that empires could not colonize, they sometimes looked for other means to control those regions. And this is where the phrase economic imperialism comes into play. And this is really significant because economic imperialism doesn't necessarily look like the same kind of political imperialism that we've been studying up to this point in class. So under economic imperialism, a nation or region is controlled through economic means by another country or corporation rather than direct imperialism. And a great example of this that you've already learned about in your reading is China. The European spheres of influence in China after the Opium Wars are a great example of economic imperialism. The Europeans did not claim territory very much. Hong Kong is a bit of an exception, but they didn't really claim a lot of territory in China for direct political control. What they did was claim exclusive trading rights or trading priorities in those regions in China. And the Chinese government was weakened through these political losses in the Opium Wars and through internal resistance and rebellion from their own people, and kind of had no choice but to give up some of this economic control in the region. Hawaii is also an example of economic imperialism at first. The fruit and sugar companies in Hawaii placed a huge amount of pressure economically and then later politically through their investments on the Hawaiian government. Although in the late 19th century, direct traditional imperialism was imposed on Hawaii. That's a little bit different from Latin America or from China. But what we see in this economic terminology, right, is the reality of the power that industrialized states had, not just politically, but in terms of controlling the economies around them. And that this power then places other countries in a position of dependence, of fragility, of kind of unfairness that then is also often reflected in their political situations as well, without making any kind of claim about the intelligence or morality or sophistication of people under the burdens of imperialism. We can identify some of these economic trends that created the situations we recognize in non-industrialized states of often being under the authority of or under the power of the more technologically industrialized states around the world. So those are some economic vocab terms that I think will be really helpful to you as you're studying the 19th century. When we get into the 20th century, I would encourage you to revisit this list of economic terminology as we get into the story of decolonization and see how many of these economic realities continue to play out into the 20th century, even as many nations and states are claiming for themselves political independence. And I think you'll find that story to be really interesting. Thanks for sticking with me in this video. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.